We're going to start out with a cup and a quarter of water, and you want to use a thermometer and make sure that this water is between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit, that is. And to that you add a single packet of dry yeast and mix that in. You let that sit for about 5 minutes or so and wait for the yeast to activate and start working. Alright, it's been about 5 minutes, and as you can see, the yeast is starting to get a little bubbly, which means it is active and ready to go. Now at this point, you add about half of the flour into the yeast and water. And you add a teaspoon of salt and start to mix all this together. As it starts to thicken up like this, you start adding the rest of the flour, a little bit at a time. Now once that's mixed up, you need to do two things. Scatter some flour on your work surface so the dough won't stick to it, and then rub some flour in your hands for the same reason. Turn this dough out onto the table. At this point, you just knead the dough several times, and let's just pull it back, flatten it back out, turn it around halfway, pull it back, flatten it out again. Just keep doing that until the dough is soft and springy. This will take about, generally speaking, about 5-10 minutes doing this. Okay, after about 10 minutes of kneading the dough, I've got it worked up into a nice little dough ball, and it is soft, springy, and elastic the way it's supposed to be. Now I'm just going to take a plate here and spray it with some non-stick spray. The dough ball on there, roll it over. Spray the top of it. And then I'm just going to cover it with a kitchen towel, and that will now sit there like that for about 2 hours or so while it rises. During that time it should approximately double in size. Okay, here we are 2 hours later, and look at our dough. That has risen very nicely. Now we just punch this thing down, pull it off of here, and we're going to roll it out. Basically, we're just going to knead it a couple of more times. Now, just work it into a rough loaf shape. Set it back on here to rise again, this time for probably about 45 minutes or so. Okay, our dough has had another 45 minutes to rise. It's risen up very nicely. Now we just take this thing and form it into a loaf and drop it into our pre-greased loaf pan. Alright, now just before putting this into the oven, which I've preheated to 425, I'm going to make one little adjustment. See, on my test run yesterday, the bread came out with a very tough, crunchy crust, which in and of itself is not necessarily bad, because a good crunchy crust can be good on a lot of breads, but it wasn't very friendly to my teeth that really don't appreciate that sort of thing. So I'm going to take and pour some melted butter on this thing so that the crust will come out a little softer. And I've got some more melted butter, and about halfway through baking I will pour some more melted butter on there. Alright, now it's time for the oven. Alright, this will go into the oven on a middle rack for about 30 to 45 minutes. And like I said, about halfway through, I'm going to put a little bit more butter across the top to make sure it doesn't come out all hard and crunchy like it did before. Whether or not you use the butter on top like that is mostly a matter of personal preference and how sore your teeth get eating crunchy crust. Me, I got real sore teeth. Okay, it's time to take the bread out. Alright, get the bread out of here. Alright. And there we go. One fresh baked loaf of homemade bread. The crust is a little bit firm on the top, but I expect that when it finally comes out and gets soaked with a little bit of butter, it'll be just fine. We'll go along the sides here. Okay, beautiful. It's not sticking to the sides at all, which means it should depan very nicely, very easily. We'll just depan this right onto another plate. Alright. One fresh hot loaf of bread. I'll grant you that with the time it takes to let it rise twice, that is time-consuming process, but it's actually very economical. It's well worth it because you come up with a very good loaf of bread, and with variations in the flour that you use and with different ingredients that you can add into it. Like you could add in some cheddar cheese or olives or raisins or any number of things that you could put into bread and make a special custom bread. You could use a white flour bread, you could use a wheat flour or rye, and come up with any number of different kinds of custom made breads.